I think that often in our zeal to prove to our Jewish people that Jesus is the promised Messiah, the one that Moses wrote about, the one that the prophets wrote about, the one who fulfilled every prophecy perfectly and who will fulfill all the unfulfilled prophecies perfectly, we sometimes gloss over the need for Messiah and what he would come to do. And I know that was true in my case in coming to faith. It was a very academic idea whether or not Jesus was the Messiah, but it wasn't until I began to see myself in relationship to God and the need that I had for his forgiveness that it became important to me. And so I think it's really good for us to talk about how we can encourage people, how we can help people see that need.
Yeah, that's right. And the need is, how else are we reconciled to God? And I think that's where we point to Yeshua. We point to Jesus saying, this is God's way to be reconciled to him.
Yeah, but that assumes that you think that reconciliation is necessary.
Right.
So if you pray every day, all Israel has a portion in the world to come, and if the default setting is, well, if you're Jewish, or at least if you're kind of a good Jew, Gan Eden, paradise, is assured for you. In my experience, the holiness of God is not something that a theist among the Jewish people needs to be convinced of. Jewish people who believe in the God of the Bible know that he's holy. There are a lot of atheists and secular Jewish people who aren't sure that God exists or are sure he doesn't exist. But if you're talking to a Jewish person who believes in God, you don't have to spend a lot of time, in my experience, trying to convince them that God is holy. On the other hand, in order for there need to be a reconciliation, there has to be a breach. And the breach, we understand, is caused by sin. Isaiah says very clearly that it's our sins that have made a separation between us and God. The first time that I heard a Jewish person say, well, I've never sinned, or my grandmother was a saint, she never sinned. I mean, I literally wanted to stand back because I thought lightning was going to come out of heaven and strike them for saying that they were sinless.
Well, there's a lot of Gentiles who believe they're sinless too.
The question is, how do we help people
how do we
come to that understanding?
So I think there's another issue that we often don't talk about, and that is that God is holy and is perfect. The issue is that reconciliation. How does he remain holy and perfect? Because otherwise the question is, well, why doesn't he just say sins are forgiven? The problem is if he does that, he becomes unjust. And so he has to remain holy and just at the same time reconciling people, which is the problem. So that is the bigger question. How does he do that? Remaining just, but at the same time reconciling those who are sinners, to bring people into his kingdom. So that's the question. And so how does that get done?
With that viewpoint, who needs reconciliation to God?
Well, the creation, anybody knows if they're just honest with themselves that we're not perfect. In fact, this is our excuse. I'm only human. We're not perfect. So we already fall short of God's holiness. So the problem is, how do we fill that gap? Because if God just says, well, your sins are forgiven, like I said before, he becomes unjust. In no way do we understand that if someone says in a court of law, well, I'm sorry, I didn't mean that the judge goes, oh, it's okay, you can go. A penalty has to be paid, right? But once the penalty is paid, justice can be done. And so I think that's the question that we're really answering.
I think a lot of Jewish people, though, reject all of this entirely. And they would say, we don't have need for a Messiah. What we need to do is tikkun olam. We need to repair the world. We need to make the world a better place, and maybe someday a perfect place, if we can just do this or that. For many Jewish people, they don't see the need for Messiah. They don't see the need for reconciliation. They're just devoted to trying to make the world a better place.
So here's a story. I was on a plane leaving Chicago, flying to Israel. A young couple comes down, sits next to me. The husband was telling me that he had just been at a conference in San Francisco. So what kind of conference? He said, well, I'm a material scientist. And we were off on a conversation. So we start talking about spiritual things. Now we're well in the air. And so, what do you do for a living? And I start talking about the need for us to have a relationship with God. I said, you said you're a scientist, and often I've met scientists. Some believe in God and some don't. What's your view? He said, well, I'm not really sure. He said, I think there may be some kind of a force out there, but I don't really have a strong commitment. I said, well, most people who believe that there's a God believe that he's holy. Well, that makes sense. Most people who believe in God believe that there's a heaven. They may not want to believe that there's a hell, but they believe that there's a heaven. I said, yeah. So I said, most people who believe that there's a heaven believe it's a perfect place. He said, makes sense. I said, so let me ask you a question. How many imperfect people can be in heaven before it's not a perfect place anymore? He said, I'm not sure I understand the question. I said, well, let's say you have a glass of pure water. He said, let me stop you right there. There's no such thing as pure water. I said, what do you mean? You can go to the grocery store and buy pure water. He said, no, you can buy purified water. There's not enough power in the world to remove all the impurities from water. I said, well, I never knew that before, but it makes the illustration even better. Let's say it was possible to have perfectly pure glass of water. How many drops of poison would you have to put in before it's not pure anymore? He said, well, the smallest particulate would mean that's not pure anymore. I said, exactly. So if heaven is a perfect place and God is holy, and Habakkuk says that God's eyes are so pure he can't even look upon evil, how many evil people can be in heaven before it's not heaven anymore? He said, well, I suppose none. I said, and how many perfect people do you know? He said, there are no perfect people. To David's point, everybody acknowledges if the goal is perfection, and I said, now you understand why I needed a Messiah, why I needed God to provide the atonement, because God is the only one who can remove the impurity of sin from my life.
And I think one of the key teachings of the Bible is that we cannot attain righteousness ourselves. It has to be God providing the way for us. Whereas I think a lot of religions and certainly a lot of humanists teach you can be good enough to achieve some type of heaven, whatever that might look like to you. The Bible teaches that we are so far from God that even our righteous acts are like filthy rags before Him.
And I think a lot of Jewish people look at evangelical Christians and say, you're sort of goody two-shoes, or you're trying to be so moral and everything else. And yes, we do aspire to be good if we can, but we realize that our righteousness is as filthy rags. We only can be redeemed through God Himself, not through our actions. But as God dwells within us through His Holy Spirit, we will hopefully be doing better, we call that process sanctification, as God is working in us to make us the kind of children He wants us to be, to make us fit for heaven.
There's an interesting story within Judaism where with the creation of man, dust, because we've been made out of dust ourselves, was taken throughout the world, from all over the world, and was put together in a specific place, and the place is where the altar of the temple is. This is the story. It's not in the Bible. However, the question comes up is, why was the dust taken from everywhere and then put on the altar? And Rashi says that because even before man was created, there's going to be an inherent flaw within mankind, and therefore the necessity of atonement is actually built into the story even before the creation of man.
Wow.
Which is the same story that we say. Yes, Adam and Eve were created perfect and able to choose, but He already knew that they were going to choose contrary to their nature. So the whole idea of a Messiah starts with, even in the New Covenant writings, that it was the Lamb that was slain before the foundation of the world. It's not a new idea, but it's an idea that's been anticipated, and the Messiah is the solution to the problem.
Not plan B, it was God's plan from the beginning.
When I have the opportunity, I like to take people back to the garden account and what the nature of the fall was, to help people begin to develop a biblical concept for what sin is, the nature of sin, because most people think of it in terms of just commission or omission, and it's obviously much deeper than that, because our entire existence is impacted by it. And so I like to take people into the creation account and say that the lie of the enemy, of the serpent, was, go ahead and eat, you'll be like God. And we think, well, is that true or not? The fact of the matter is it was true, because God Himself says they've eaten and have become like one of us. And so I ask the question, in what way did man become like God at that moment that wasn't good for man? And try to help people understand that God gave us 5 senses to do the work He created us to do in the garden, but He gave us no sense, no ability to discern immaterial, spiritual, metaphysical truth. That even before the fall, we were dependent on Him for that. And it's taking that authority on ourselves. That is the nature of sin. And that just gets played out in our lives and in culture and in society and in governments, and just to help people begin to wrestle with that.
We start to see the idea of God providing the solution right in the beginning in Genesis, where He brings the 2 skins of animals to cover Adam and Eve. Now, it doesn't specifically say that 2 animals were killed. However, we can easily conclude that the fact that He's got 2 animal skins without the animals most likely means that there was blood, that they took the place of Adam and Eve who had sinned. And so we see this whole idea come along a little bit further when we speak about Leviticus 17:11, where it is the nephesh, the soul that is in the blood, because the blood is the most important part. In fact, without our blood, we fail to live. And so somehow, in some way, the Lord knew that this was going to be a problem, And the idea of blood atonement is established right from the beginning, and then the story plays out from there.
Yeah, that's really good, that the idea of Jesus' blood providing atonement for sins is not something that just happened upon his death. This is rooted in the story of God.
We can think even of Passover and the blood that was sprinkled above the doorpost. And we have all these images and symbols in the Tanakh that prepare us for understanding why the blood is important, but it's important because it's related to our sinful nature and atonement. In the temple, the most important day was Yom Kippur, the day of covering, where God would forgive the sins of the high priest first and of the whole nation of Israel if they repented, but it was through the blood sacrifice.
It's such an important concept that it's in the very name of man. Adam, this is what it is. Dam is the Hebrew word for blood. It is in his name. And so right from the beginning, blood becomes a central focus. And without it, there is no forgiveness of sins, as we read in the book of Hebrews.
Well, guys, thanks so much for helping us understand really our need for atonement, our need for a Messiah, and the reality that the scriptures teach that each one of us have this need, and we are separated from God until such time as we accept the work that God has done on our behalf.